Hi there. Thank you for joining UnSCRIPted. I'm Angela Kashuba, Dean of the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. Here we have an amazing community at this school with a shared goal of solving the world's most pressing healthcare challenges. And I'm excited for you to hear unscripted stories from our alums, our students, our faculty, our staff, and our partners. And so today I have invited Jay Campbell, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Board of Pharmacy, to join me in my office. Welcome, Jay. Thanks so much
Angela,
for coming.
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here.
So I understand that pharmacy was not your first choice.
No, well, it may have been the first choice that I gave a lot of thought to. Maybe that would be the way to describe it. But yeah, when I came to Carolina, I put down a business major, and that lasted through Econ 10 for honors. And I sort of made a deal with God. If he could get me out of Econ 10 without wrecking my GPA, I would never step foot in Gardner Hall again. So I decided I had to do something else. So I was a big science kid in high school, and I had a great high school chemistry teacher who was a UNC alum. And pharmacy sort of came in because one of my hallmates in my dorm at Morrison, Mike Barnes, he was absolutely committed to going to pharmacy school. And then Mike and I, that summer after my freshman year, lived in the campus I house. So I stayed up here to work in a lab, and I lived in the campus I house. So I got to know a lot of those guys. Those would have been the guys that graduated around 90, 91, 89, that crew. And so that sort of got me into the network, and that's when I gave pharmacy a hard look and decided that's what I wanted to do.
That's awesome. So as you went through the pharmacy program, what were you thinking in terms of a career? Yeah,
so I did a lot of work in Boka Hadzija's lab, pharmaceutics lab, when I was here in pharmacy school. And so I decided I was going to go into a PhD program in pharmaceutics. And of course, Boka was thrilled about that. And I sort of veered off of that path, obviously, at some point. But that was the initial plan.
Okay. So when you mention Boka Hadzija's name, that brings back a lot of memories for a lot of people.
Sure.
And she was very well known for mentorship and having a very student-centered approach. So talk about your experience with Boka.
I met Boka sort of through friends. Some of the folks at Campus I, she was a dear friend throughout school. You're right to say she was student focused. She absolutely was. And so she was a tremendous friend and mentor, not just for academic things. She was someone you could go chat with. And I was thrilled when I came back to Chapel Hill in 2006. Boka was one of the first folks from sort of my pharmacy school life who reached back out to me. And I was glad that in Boka's remaining years after I moved back here, we got together very regularly and had lunch. And she did love to gossip too. And so she had somebody she could share the gossip with.
That's so funny. So you graduate pharmacy school, and then what?
So Boka had pulled some strings and got me a job at Glaxo back when it was just Glaxo and when they actually did research over in RTP.
Yes.
And so I was doing pharmaceutics research and in the process of applying to graduate programs. And what I figured out about 3 months into that was, as much as I liked theoretical science, applied science, bench science, it's not that I didn't like it, I just wasn't any good at it. So I had some thought of law school because my last year here, the Student Senate had been working. I'm not taking credit for all of this because this was about a 3-year effort. The Student Senate at the time had been working to try to get some changes to the Board of Pharmacy's rules governing the circumstances under which you acquired your experiential hours for a licensure. It used to be you had to do a fair bit of extracurricular experiential work to get your licensure hours. And the board at the time had a rule that said that even if you were working in some capacity in a pharmacy, if you were taking courses simultaneously, you could not count those hours toward your experiential.
It was considered a conflict.
I don't know if it was. I never got a great explanation as to what it was, which was part of what suggested to me perhaps we don't need the rule if nobody's really explaining.
Right.
But one explanation I'd heard was this thought of, well, when you're taking courses, we want you to be focused on your courses and not distracted by that frankly didn't make a lot of sense to me. But there had been a fairly substantial increase in the number of students starting pharmacy school who had baccalaureate degrees and were married or had been in a different career for some period of time. And so for these folks, a lot of them were having to take summer classes to sort of catch up, and the rest, they were looking at getting out of pharmacy school with no allowable way. So we had been working on that. In my last year here with the Senate, the board did finally pass that rule. So I'd gotten to know David Work, my predecessor, through that, and it sort of sparked, I guess, more of an interest than I realized at the time. It laid a little bit of a foundation for maybe law is something I'd be interested in. And it went from there, and I shifted to law school. I don't think Boka ever forgave me for
going to law school.
For leaving science behind and moving on to law school.
But you never left pharmacy behind.
I never left pharmacy.
Yeah.
It's initially my law career really, there was no intersection between pharmacy and my law practice. I was an appellate litigator.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit.
So I graduated from law school at Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
And I clerked on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal court of appeals based in Boston. I have to give this aside. One of my co-clerks was Ketanji Brown Jackson, now Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I have to say, she is brilliant and kind, and she's every bit the person. Now, of course, I've had people ask, well, when you were clerking with her, could you proceed? No, of course not. You can't, something like that happening is, less than the chances of a lightning bolt hitting you. So no, I mean, we certainly didn't see that, my other co-clerk and I. But we certainly did appreciate how brilliant she was and how fundamentally kind she was. And it was a fun clerkship year. So I did that for a year. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I was an appellate litigation lawyer for 7 years at a large firm there. Really interesting stuff.
Yes.
I argued a case in the Supreme Court as a fairly junior associate. That was an unbelievable experience.
So how did that come about?
So one of the things that law firms then and now do, the large law firms with large appellate practices, is they tend to detail some associate with the job of sort of looking through newly decided Court of Appeals cases and seeing, are any of these likely candidates for Supreme Court review? And so over the years, I would identify different cases, and it had some success. I think in the 4 years I did that, I brought in 5 cases to our firm that got granted and reviewed by the Supreme Court. And another one came in, and I went to the partner for whom I did this work, and I told him, I said, well, I've identified this one, and I do think it's really promising in terms of review. And the partner said, well, if you can convince them to let us have the case, then you can have it.
Wow.
And I sort of, wait a minute, what's the trick here?
Yes.
I said, you mean I could argue that? He said, yeah, if you can get this one to the firm and you get cert granted, you can argue this case. And so I did. It was, of course, he supervised me. And Lord knows anybody that knows me knows I require constant supervision. But so it got granted, and true to his word, the partner let me keep it. And I owe him more of a debt than I realized at the time. When that case did get granted, notwithstanding what he had said, there was, I later found out, some scrambling behind the scenes that some partners and other more senior people sort of made a play to say, well, why should he argue this case? He's junior. I'm a partner, and I've never argued one. But he stood firm, and so I argued the case in December of 2003. It was not my first time sitting at counsel table. I had been second chair for 2 other Supreme Court arguments, which don't misunderstand. Second chair is mostly me just sitting there. Isn't this cool? Hey, if I can wait in the gallery there. But I had a great experience. The argument was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I did not win the case. I lost it 6-3, but it was an amazing experience, and I loved all of that kind of work. It was really high ether stuff. Yeah. But ultimately, I changed it. Going into a law practice like that, it is going to be all consuming, and you understand that going in. I have no bitterness about that, but after the kids were born and some other things, there was a time I finally thought, as much as I love this, I feel like I'm spreading myself too thin. And so I left D.C., practiced law in Charlotte, and for less than 2 years. And it was while I was practicing law in Charlotte that Dave Work got in touch with me and told me he was going to retire and asked me to think about.
Yeah. So what went through your head when you were thinking about executive director of the Board of Pharmacy?
It was the funniest part was, and my best friend in pharmacy school, Richard Sterling, emailed me immediately to tell me this when it became public that Dave was retiring to do his church. And Rich emailed me and said, "You said back in our last year that you'd be interested in that job if it ever came open." So that was how that, of course, then went through the search process, and which was an interesting experience to me because I really had never been through a search like that. Like I'm sure you have with some of your, but I'd always been the standard sort of you're applying for a job and that kind of thing. It's the first time I'd had a search, but the story I got to tell you is before we got to the interview. Yeah. My pharmacist license was not active. I had let it lapse in 1998 because I was practicing law. I never used this. Right. And as a matter of state law, the executive director of the Board of Pharmacy must be a licensed pharmacist. I thought, well, I better figure this out. Yes. When I let my license lapse, the board's only requirement was you apply to reinstate and you catch up all of your CE. Okay. I thought, all right, well, that's going to be sort of a pain in the neck to do, but whatever. I can catch 8 years CE out nights, whatever. I can get that done. But it had changed in the interim, and the board's default policy had become if you were out of practice, and by out of practice they meant out of license for 5 years or more, you had to retake NAPLEX, you had to retake MPJE, you had to redo all 1,500 hours of practical experience. Wow. And we were well into this thing. Yeah. So I called Dave one night and said, "Dave, I am afraid I'm going to have to probably pull out of this thing." Dave's like, Why? And I said, "Well, my license has been inactive for over 7 years." I said, "Look, MPJ, if I can't pass that, y'all probably shouldn't offer me the job anyway." I said, "NAPLEX, I suppose you give me a couple of months and some intensive prep work, I might could backfill that." I said, "But then the hours, I can't possibly do 2/3 of a year." And Dave said, No. That is a baseline. The board can make an individual decision because he did not want to start all over. And so we had to have a special board. The board convened a special meeting to figure out how to give me a license. And so I did have to take and pass the MPJ. Yeah. Thank goodness they did not make me take NAPLEX again, with the understanding that I was not going to be moving ever into any sort of clinical role. Right. And they did make me do several hundred experiential hours, but they said that Dave could be my preceptor. I see. So for 4 months, I was hired in February of 2006, and for 4 months, I was not the executive director of the Board of Pharmacy because legally I could not be. Yes. I was the associate executive director of the Board of Pharmacy, and almost the day that I completed my hours, that was Dave's last day, and then I became executive director. So the lesson in all that is don't let your license lapse. You never know.
Well, I'll tell you, we are better for it, for sure. You are a beloved teacher. Can you talk about that? We are also the beneficiary.
I can. Yeah. Angela, I've told this to many people. The most professionally satisfying thing that I do and have ever done, and matched up against appellate litigation, all the rest of it, is to teach. Wow. And I got started at Wingate, and for several years I taught both at Wingate and here. Eventually the travel for Wingate got to be too much, but it is it is rewarding. In a lot of ways, personally, it's rewarding. It does scratch that appellate lawyer itch a
Yeah.
little bit that I miss sometimes. It's
Yes.
still standing up and making a presentation.
Yes.
And the students are so smart and they're so prepared. And so it forces me to keep my pencil sharp on the
Yeah.
law. You can't BS them.
Yes.
One of the drawbacks to my job is you inevitably have to spend a fair amount of your time dealing with the folks who aren't doing things the way they should be. Now, that's a very, very small percentage of pharmacists, but it's disproportionately part of what I do. That's the nature of the job.
Sure.
So coming here and teaching every spring with these brilliant, motivated students, it sort of refills the soul and the optimism, and you realize, hey, don't get your head out of the weeds of the very few troublemakers here and take a look around at how great the students coming into the practice are. So I'm grateful to be able to do it.
I love that teaching fills your cup. I think that's
really,
wonderful.
really
Jay, thank you so much
Oh,
for
Angela,
spending time
thanks
with
for
us
having
today.
me. Yeah, you bet.
This has been great.
I've enjoyed it.
And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Unscripted. We have wonderful stories of people who make the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy excellent. And I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Unscripted, where we are having conversations with people who are advancing medicine for life.